What is the dumbest thing you have done while horny? Story 1. I ended up spending time with an attractive but very unpredictable woman who used to hang around our local bar. Back at her place, she put on her Lauryn Hill CD, took off all her clothes, and tried to dance in a seductive way. We were both pretty drunk. Things started to get intimate when suddenly her 18-year-old son walked into the room and got really upset about what was happening. She told him to leave, and a huge argument broke out between them. Remember, she's drunk and undressed, and I'm sitting on the sofa feeling incredibly awkward. I quickly realized I needed to leave, got dressed, and headed out as fast as I could. Apparently, she's now serving time for assaulting her boyfriend, so I feel pretty lucky to have left when I did. Story 2. I worked at a restaurant that was rarely busy, and an older, very attractive woman used to come in and sit by herself most nights. One evening, she was drinking quite a bit and talking to the bartender, expressing how she wished she could meet someone to spend the evening with. The bartender came to the back and shared with us what the woman, Susan, a regular customer, was looking for that night. I was about 20 at the time and decided to step outside to take out the trash. I saw Susan heading to her car. I didn't really know what to say, but I called out to her. And when she turned around, she jokingly asked if I wanted to spend the evening with her. I responded, "That sounds good," and ended up getting into her car. Even though I wasn't entirely sure what was going to happen, things escalated quickly. That was 15 years ago, and it remains one of the most memorable nights of my life. Story 3. In my early 20s, I worked a small summer job in a warehouse in my hometown. I developed a bit of a crush on an older woman, Tina, not her real name, but she seemed so out of my league that I never even tried to make a move. One day, during some friendly conversation, I asked if she wanted to hang out. She agreed, and we ended up at her place, drinking and sharing stories. At one point, she got quiet, looked lost in thought, and asked if we could go for a drive. While we were driving, she told me about how she used to drive around every night but had to stop because of a DUI. She then gave me directions to a neighborhood cul-de-sac. When we arrived, I realized we were parked outside the house of Bill, our supervisor. She explained that she and Bill used to have a relationship, but he wouldn't leave his family, and now he avoids her. This set off alarm bells in my head, but before I could react, she started getting physically close. The rest of the summer, we would sit in front of Bill's house in silence, and she would express her feelings in unusual ways. September came, and I left for university, still thinking back to that strange summer. Story 4. My roommate was dyeing his hair black, and the girl helping him was extremely attractive. After they finished, she came into the living room, sat next to me on the couch, and started watching me play video games. She casually ran her hands through my hair and said, "You know, we have some dye left. I bet you'd look great with black hair." Even though I had a bad reaction to a henna tattoo the previous summer, I couldn't resist her suggestion and agreed. It looked good at first, but by the second day, my scalp was itchy, and by the third, it was red. By the next morning, my face was so swollen I couldn't open one of my eyes. When I looked in the mirror, I freaked out. The best way to describe how I looked is like a character from a movie, except with black hair. It took a month for the swelling to go down, but during that time, the girl would come over often, and we spent time together, even though I looked like a mess. Story 5. I had a weird experience involving a jar of grape jelly. I had taken it from a store earlier that day and was eager to use it when I got home. Things didn't go as planned, and just as I was about to give up, my parents came home earlier than expected. I had no time to clean up the mess, so I bundled everything up in a shirt, shoved it under my bed, and quickly pulled my clothes back on. I greeted my parents, trying to act as naturally as possible, but it was tough because the situation was so uncomfortable. I had to talk with them in the kitchen for a good half hour while feeling completely embarrassed. It was one of the most awkward moments of my life, and I was reminded of it for weeks afterward. Story 6. A girl I was interested in invited me over for some drinks. She lived on a large property on the edge of town. My coworker dropped me off just outside her gated entrance around midnight. What she failed to mention was that she had a large Rottweiler who was barking like crazy at me from the other side of the fence. This was before I had a cell phone, so I had no way of contacting her. Being young and impulsive, I decided to sneak around the property and hop the fence. I carefully made my way to the front door, fully aware that the dog could come after me at any moment. Luckily, I made it, and once the dog realized I wasn't a threat, he calmed down. I once drove 100 miles to meet up with a girl, but my car broke down just as I got off the exit. Her dad came out to give me a push, and it turned out they were having a family party, so I was automatically invited. It was surreal sitting down and eating with a family who had never met or heard of me until that day, all while my mind was elsewhere. She apologized multiple times, and I did too for my car trouble. In the end, nothing happened between us. But I did receive a nice lecture from her parents about how driving 100 miles for something like that wasn't worth it, and how it wasn't the best decision. That day taught me a valuable lesson. Since then, I've never driven more than 30 miles for something similar. Story 7. I once drove 100 miles to meet up with a girl, but my car broke down just as I got off the exit. Her dad came out to give me a push, and it turned out they were having a family party, so I was automatically invited. It was surreal sitting down and eating with a family who had never met or heard of me until that day, all while my mind was elsewhere. She apologized multiple times, and I did too for my car trouble. In the end, nothing happened between us, but I did receive a nice lecture from her parents about how driving 100 miles for something like that wasn't worth it, and how it wasn't the best decision. That day taught me a valuable lesson. Since then, I've never driven more than 30 miles for something similar. Story 8. My first boyfriend and I were at his grandma's farm, which was really just a lot of wooded land. There were multiple deer stands, but the cheap kind with no blind and a very flimsy guardrail that would hit you at about waist height if you were a 16-year-old, 5'10" boy. This particular stand was quite high, but I don't know exactly how high. We were getting close to each other, and eventually our pants came off. I climbed onto one of the two corners of the flimsy guardrail with my legs at a 90-degree angle, following these guardrails, and facing him, with my back toward the ground in case I fell off. Something you should know is that he was always very sensitive, vocal, and expressive. He tended to get excited quickly. Even 10 years later, I still think he was amazing just because of how much excitement he brought. That day, when he had a hold of my back while we were kissing, he started trembling as if he was about to finish. I had been relying on him to hold me up so I wouldn't fall, but as he reached his limit, he reflexively scratched my back pretty hard. I reacted by pulling away a bit, and he realized what he did, so he also tried to stop at the same time. In that moment, he let go of me slightly, and I started falling backward. He quickly pulled me back into a bear hug and held on tightly, keeping me from falling off the stand. That moment stayed with me for years. It was the way he grabbed me and saved me from what could have been a serious injury that left a lasting impression. Story 9. Yesterday, I ended a short-lived relationship with my coworker. I thought she was the girl of my dreams, and a few months back on my birthday, she took me home. As we were getting closer in bed, she said, "I don't really know how to say this, but I have herpes." In my drunken and passionate state on my birthday with the girl I had been dreaming about for weeks, I decided that making a big commitment would win her over. So I said, "Do you know how much I connect with you?" It was a vague way to express my intentions, but she said yes, so I went ahead without much thought. Little did I know, she had no plans for anything long-term, and a few months into us seeing each other, she told me she was moving across the country soon and wouldn't be coming back. Yesterday, I sent her a message, venting about how things ended and how I felt about her, even though I know this situation is largely my fault. She cut off contact, and now we still have to work together for a month. I've really set myself up for some emotional turmoil. Trust me, I wouldn't recommend making such risky decisions to show affection. Story 10. After getting off my Friday night shift as a barback at 1 a.m., I decided to drive 4 hours to Scranton, Pennsylvania, to visit my girlfriend. I was completely sober, no alcohol or substances in my system, but I was exhausted, and it definitely affected my driving. The sound of my wheels hitting rumble strips woke me up more than once. When I didn't text my girlfriend that I had arrived around 5 or 6 a.m., she got worried and went looking for me. Fortunately, she didn't have to travel far. I had made it to her dorm parking lot, taken out my keys, and closed my eyes to relax for a moment. I ended up passing out in the driver's seat. Everything worked out in the end. We've been together for 11 years and happily married for 3. But looking back, it was a reckless decision. There were multiple rest stops and hotels along the way, and I was so tired that we didn't even spend time together until later that day. I'm lucky I didn't harm myself or someone else. Story 11. I was on a group date with my buddy, his girlfriend, and her best friend. After a few cocktails, her friend asked if I wanted to take a walk to get some fresh air and have a more private conversation. We ended up making out, and she suggested we sit on a low wall. Things started getting a bit heated, and she told me it was all part of her plan. To avoid falling off the wall, we decided to lie down on the grass next to a bush. As I bent over her, I felt something unpleasant under my left hand. It felt like wet mud. Then we started smelling something horrible. I told her to move, and when I pulled my hand out, I realized it was a pile of dog mess. At first, I thought I had stepped in it, but then I noticed her back, her top, and her hair, completely smeared with it. It wasn't just a little bit, it was everywhere. We both panicked. I ran back to the bar to grab some wet and dry towels, laughing and crying all at once. I tried cleaning my hand with the grass, but it didn't do much to get rid of the smell. Even after washing my hands with soap, it was still bad. I returned to her, cleaned her back as best as I could, and gave her my shirt because her clothes were ruined. Then I called my friend and his girlfriend, who had already been looking for us, to pick us up. It was one of the most awkward moments ever, sitting in the car smelling terrible, with me shirtless and her holding her bra and ruined clothes. Honestly, I feel traumatized, and I'm worried she might never want to see me again. Story 12. After my ex-wife and I separated, she ended up getting pregnant. She spread rumors about me in both cities where we had lived and among our group of friends, threatening to take everything from me. Despite this, we got back together briefly, and after a few days, we were intimate again, and she got pregnant. Unfortunately, after she found out, she did the same things as before, telling me I'd never see my child and spreading lies that I was abusive and controlling. Living in states where fathers have limited rights, it made things even harder for me. Sadly, and somewhat fortunately for my situation, she lost the child at 20 weeks. We have since divorced. Story 13. I went to the store for my now ex-wife and her best friend because they wanted wine. As I walked past my adjoining neighbor's house, she asked me to grab a bottle for her too. When I came back, her door was open, and I called out to her. She called me in, and I found her in a suggestive position wearing some revealing clothes. We ended up getting intimate right there, up against the wall, the same wall that separated our two houses. Later, when I went back into my house, my ex-wife was sitting on a floor cushion leaning up against that very wall. After drinking a lot of wine, my ex-wife, her best friend, and I had a threesome. We had always had a somewhat open relationship, so I told her about what had happened with the neighbor. About a week later, I had another encounter with the neighbor, and not long after that, I came home from work to find my wife in bed with both the neighbor and her husband. I had to get involved again, yet. Story 14. It was the year 2001, and I was in my first year of university. The computer labs in the library were open late, and internet security wasn't as advanced as it is now. One night I decided to push the limits and see if I could download some videos onto my floppy disk. I picked a secluded station in the back of the lab, hoping no one would notice. Porn wasn't as accessible back then as it is now, but there was a website I used to visit in my late teens. I managed to access it and started watching a few videos. I had a backup browser window open just in case anyone walked by. As I watched, I started getting more and more worked up and had to adjust myself under the desk. I found a video that was really getting me excited. I discreetly adjusted my position and rocked back and forth in my chair, trying to keep it under control. Eventually, I started wondering if I should just go for it. I checked to make sure no one was around and decided to continue my discreet method under the desk. Before I knew it, I had an unfortunate accident in my pants. I was left with a mess that soaked through my jeans. With no car and no place to go on campus, I had to walk home feeling embarrassed. Luckily, no one seemed to suspect anything. Story 15. I once met a beautiful, talented artist in the lobby of a hostel in NYC. She took me to the women's dorm, where we draped a blanket over her bunk bed for privacy. The women in the bunk next to us could see what was going on. We exchanged numbers, and when I returned to the city 4 days later, we reconnected and got a hotel room. She was very loud during our time together, and later told me she hadn't been intimate for a year because of personal issues with her past relationships. She also shared some troubling and unusual thoughts, including a belief that Donald Trump would give her an apartment because she was an artist. We spent a few days together, during which she would drop her art off at various high-end galleries and even Trump Tower, though no one was expecting her work. At that point, I realized she was struggling with mental health issues, and I felt terrible about leaving her. She asked if she could move in with me, but I told her I lived with my mom. Despite that, she still wanted to move in. I said goodbye before leaving the city, And for about 6 months, she sent me strange texts and emails, even claiming I'd be contacted by the authorities. Story 16. I've never told anyone about this, and I'm not sure this is the right place, but it came to mind after years of not thinking about it. I had a connection with my cousin's cousin's longtime girlfriend. My cousin was the son of my mom's sister, and his cousin was the son of his dad's brother. I didn't know his cousin, only that he was in the Navy and rarely around. I met her at my cousin's little sister's confirmation. I was 19, and she was about 15 years older than me. I never would have guessed it. She was beautiful, with a lovely smile and the cutest eyes, especially when she laughed. During the family gathering, I was trying to entertain the group by telling jokes and quoting funny movies, and she was laughing along with everyone else. It was around 2002, so we had cell phones, and we exchanged numbers because we both feared the day would be dull, but it turned out to be fun. For the next year or two, we kept in touch and met at other family events. Her boyfriend was never around, and she told me she felt lonely. I was still a virgin and liked her a lot, so one night we arranged to meet at her place. I still lived with my parents at the time. It was the middle of the night, and I didn't know the area, but she gave me instructions, and somehow I made it there. That first night, we cuddled and made out a little before falling asleep in each other's arms. We met a few more times like that, and eventually we had sex for the first time. It was my first time, and it was a lovely experience. Sometimes we had sex, and other times we just cuddled, and it was fine. At some point it stopped, though I can't recall exactly when or why. We rarely texted after that, but there were no hard feelings. I later heard she had left my cousin's cousin and was dating someone else. I think she was happy, and I was happy for her. Then in 2013, I went to wish her a happy birthday on Facebook and learned that she had passed away from cancer a few months earlier. That news still makes me sad whenever I think about her. I'll never forget her smile and that first night when I found her place, even though I had no idea where I was going. Story 17. Back in college, I hadn't hooked up with anyone in a while. I met a girl at a house party, and as it was winding down, she asked me to come back to her place. Being eager, I agreed and hurried over. Once inside her apartment, she started undressing me right in the front room, and I reciprocated. In no time, we were making out on the couch. Then she got up, walked into her room, and called back, "Well, are you coming?" She seemed more assertive than she had been at the party, but I didn't mind. We moved to the bed, and after a while, we were done. I commented, "That was amazing." To this, she said, "Good, now get out." I must have looked confused because she repeated, "Get out," even louder. I went to the front room to get dressed, and as I was doing so, she came out with a smile, grabbed a beer from the fridge, and casually asked me where I was going. She even brought me a beer. That's when everything clicked. I told her what she had said just minutes earlier, and she laughed, denying it ever happened. Then she led me back to the bedroom, and we started again, but this time with a more relaxed vibe. Over the next week, I realized she had two distinct personalities. One side was more intense, while the other was more laid back. After about 2 months, it became too much for me. I ended things with the crazy side first, and then found a way to break up with the nice side too. A few weeks later, I saw her with a cast. She told me she had blacked out at a party and kicked in her new boyfriend's window while looking for him, but she didn't remember any of it. That's when I realized I had made the right decision to move on. Story 18. When I was younger and really curious, I couldn't get my hands on a proper toy, so I ended up using the handle of a maraca. The dumb part? My entire family was home at the time, and my bedroom door was mostly glass, barely frosted, and I wasn't allowed to lock it. I was right in front of the door, just about to get started, when I heard my mom coming up the stairs. I panicked and shoved the maraca handle, which was covered in lotion, under the covers. Looking back, that wasn't even the dumbest thing I did. Around the same time, I also tried using that same maraca handle at school. Once, during a lockdown drill, I thought it was a good idea to put it in, and another time I actually tried to walk around school with it. During lunch, I realized I had rushed too much and was limping. I made it just a few steps out of the bathroom before deciding there was no way I could limp past the entire cafeteria, so I went back to take it out and put it in my backpack. It's kind of crazy to think about now, but I guess I've always been a bit adventurous. Story 19. I've only had a handful of one-night stands, as they usually make me feel a bit off afterward. I also tend to avoid them if alcohol is involved because of consent concerns. But one night I was feeling particularly frustrated. It had been a while since my last relationship, and I'd been busy with work. I went to a bar, and there was this young redhead there. She had an athletic figure, and I couldn't help but notice her curves. She was with a guy who was clearly in the friend zone, complaining about her boyfriend to him. Me, being a bit of a show-off, bought a couple of rounds for the bar while only casually chatting with some guy about pool. It worked. The redhead noticed, and we started flirting. Her friend wasn't happy, but I didn't care. After a cigarette break where she asked me to spank her, we decided to head back to my place. We got there, smoked a little, had a few more drinks, and things got more intimate. She was taking off an article of clothing in every room, and eventually we ended up on the couch. I was pretty out of it from the drinks and other stuff, but still had enough energy to get up and find some protection. When I returned, she took it off me and said no. Normally that would have been a deal breaker, but I was too far gone to care. At one point during the night, her mom called me. She had gotten my number because the redhead had texted her friend from my phone earlier for safety. It was a strange reality check. The next morning I didn't feel great, so I showered and didn't make breakfast like I normally would. I told her I had to get to work, but she asked to stay. I reminded her that her kids were looking for her, which didn't seem to bother her. I felt regret creeping in. I called a cab for her, but she said she didn't have money for it, so I gave her $40 and sent her on her way. Later I found out I had contracted chlamydia. It wasn't a big deal, easily treatable, but still an unpleasant surprise. Around the same time, my place was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken, but it was unsettling. A month later, she called and told me she was pregnant. I explained that it was unlikely since I had been snipped and had sperm on ice, but I offered to meet up and talk. She never responded again after that. Story 20. My best friend was talking to a girl at our friend's grandparents' house. We were 20 and 18 at the time. After about an hour, she asked him to walk her out to her car. They were gone for 45 minutes, and no one even noticed they had left. Meanwhile, in the car, she decided to give him some attention in the driveway. Just as things were getting more intense, the girl's grandpa walked up to the car, knocked on the window, and asked what was going on. My friend, being a bit of a joker, rolled down the window and told the grandpa exactly what was happening. Needless to say, Grandpa was not amused. He pulled out a gun, told my friend to leave immediately, and the girl quickly pushed him out of the car and drove off. My best friend had a problem, though. I was his ride, and he had no way to get back inside. So he jumped the fence, snuck around the back of the house, and called me, asking me to let him in the back door. Right then, Grandpa came around the corner with the gun still in hand and asked, "Who's Michael?" I froze. He gave me 30 seconds to get my things and get out before he'd start shooting. I ran inside, grabbed everything, and we left as fast as possible. Story 21. Okay, so I'm into some unique interests, and I'm not ashamed of much anymore. However, there was one moment in particular that still makes me cringe to this day. I had a Kik account set up where I could chat with various people, including one person who was always very sweet and fun to talk to. I thought of them almost like a sibling. They weren't exactly attractive in the traditional sense, but we got along. One night I was feeling particularly lonely and decided to message them. We started chatting and things escalated quickly. They admitted they were feeling a bit more than just friendly and suggested we video chat. Normally, I never agree to video calls unless I know the person well and feel comfortable. But for some reason that night, I went along with it. What followed was far more awkward than I expected. They greeted me in a way that immediately made me feel uncomfortable, but I figured I would just go along with it. However, the conversation took a strange turn when they started asking me to say unusual things and tried to direct the conversation in an odd way. Eventually, they said they were tired and ended the call, clearly feeling embarrassed. The whole experience was a reminder of why I'm usually cautious about who I interact with online. It left me feeling uncomfortable and unsure about ever video chatting with strangers again. It's one of those moments that still makes me cringe when I think about it. Story 22. It was fairly late at night, around 1:30 a.m., when I started chatting with someone on an app. The conversation was intense, and it seemed like we were hitting it off. The bonus was that they lived less than 3 miles away, so we decided to meet. They suggested I show up at their place in a specific outfit, and at the time, it seemed like a reasonable idea. In the heat of the moment, I agreed. I drove over with my regular clothes on and found their street. The night was warm and quiet as I arrived. However, when I got there, things started to feel a bit off. The door wasn't open as promised, and no one answered when I rang the bell. I waited for a while, but nothing happened. After a few moments, it hit me that something wasn't right. It began to dawn on me that I might have been set up. I quickly left, but a few blocks away, Police cars passed me. It was then that I realized how serious the situation could have been. Moments later, I saw the flashing lights behind me, and I was pulled over. The officer was confused about my situation, and I explained everything, showing the chat messages as proof. After what felt like forever, the officer returned my license and told me to be more careful in the future. It was an embarrassing and cringeworthy experience that taught me to always think twice before acting impulsively. Story 23. I was at a friend's house, one of the girls in my small group of close friends. After school, I went to her place to hang out before heading off to driver's ed. At some point, I made a rather awkward and impulsive decision, hoping it would lead to something. I asked her for a favor, and she eventually agreed, but not in the way I expected. She flicked me and warned me not to ask again, with a playful yet sharp response. It was definitely a bit of an odd situation, but things didn't escalate beyond that. I then mentioned I needed to deal with things on my own, and she didn't seem to mind. She even made a few comments here and there, watching but mostly carrying on with her day. Looking back, the whole experience was strange, but she was cool about it. We remained friends, and I'm not sure if she enjoyed any of it, but it never led to anything beyond that moment. Story 24. When I was 15, my then-girlfriend and I were at her friend's house. Her friend's mom was there, along with another teenage couple. We were all in the living room watching The Nightmare Before Christmas, and my girlfriend and I were sharing a blanket on the couch. Things got a bit playful under the blanket, but I was trying to stay discreet. At one point, the friend's mom, who wasn't exactly someone you'd want sitting next to you during such a moment, came in and sat right beside me. My girlfriend didn't stop what she was doing, and I was now juggling multiple things, managing the blanket, keeping my cool, engaging in conversation with the mom, and watching the movie. Then, the "This Is Halloween" song started playing, and somehow the rhythm matched what was going on under the blanket. Everyone, including the mom, started singing along while I was just trying to stay composed. As the song reached its high point, I had an embarrassing moment, but I did my best to hide it. To make matters worse, the mom tried to get me to join in the singing, and I had to act quickly to cover up what had just happened. I excused myself to the bathroom, cleaned up, and managed to get through the rest of the night without any more close calls. Story 25. One night around 11 p.m., one of my exes called me, crying because her boyfriend had hit her. Concerned for her, I went and picked her up, letting her spend the night at my house. She was understandably upset and cried a lot throughout the night as we talked. I've never been great at dealing with emotional situations, and at some point, we ended up comforting each other in a more physical way. It wasn't something I planned, but it seemed to calm her down. The next day, her boyfriend came to pick her up. Before they left, I took him aside and told him clearly that if he ever hurt her again, there would be serious consequences. He seemed to get the message, and as far as I know, he never hurt her again. While it was an uncomfortable situation, I felt I did what I needed to protect her from any future harm. Story 26. I once went home with an older woman, someone who was twice my age. She wasn't particularly attractive, and the whole situation felt a bit off from the start. She lived in a high-rise apartment and had some peculiar habits. At one point, she insisted on wrapping a telephone cord around my neck, which felt strange, but I went along with it, figuring I could easily get out of it if things went too far. The whole experience was uncomfortable, and I quickly realized it wasn't something I wanted to be part of. I excused myself afterward, cleaned up, and decided to leave. The encounter left me feeling pretty unsettled, so I headed back to the bar to forget about it. Later that night, I ended up with another woman, this time someone more my type. When we got to her place, her apartment was in pretty bad shape, filthy actually. I even ended up cleaning her kitchen while she showered, trying to distract myself from the earlier part of the night. But by the time she was ready to fool around, I had lost all interest. I just wanted to sleep and move on from the whole experience. The next morning, I left early and walked back to my car, feeling confused about the choices I'd made. Looking back, I realized my standards were pretty low that night, likely due to a mix of poor decisions and too much drinking. It's one of those nights I'm not too proud of, but I definitely learned from it. Story 27. Once, during the early days of puberty, my parents took me camping by the lake, and I had to share a tent with my little brother. As a young teenager, I found this situation highly inconvenient. Privacy was in short supply, and I wasn't about to indulge in any personal activities with my brother right next to me. Even though it wouldn't have taken long, once is never enough. What was I to do? As I lay there, a plan came to me. I quietly snuck out of the tent, put on my life vest, and slowly waded into the cold, still waters of the lake. First my ankles, then my knees, and eventually I was up to my neck, floating in the peaceful, moonlit water. The silence and solitude were perfect, and for a moment I felt like I had the entire universe to myself. I took a moment to enjoy the starry sky, the calm reflection of the moon on the water, and the feeling of being truly alone. It was a brief escape from the chaos of my developing teenage mind, a moment of clarity. After a few moments of reflection, I returned to the tent feeling a little more at ease. As time went on, I became resourceful in finding privacy, like hiding under the bed or retreating to the back seat of the van during trips. In a family with little privacy, you had to get creative. Story 28. When I was 19, I made a terrible mistake. My best friend's girlfriend, Debbie, had spent the night at my house with her friend Allison. Earlier in the day, Debbie had been with my friend Ashton, and it turns out she lost her virginity to him just hours before. The night they came over, things took a wrong turn. We all ended up hanging out at my place because Ashton had a strict curfew and the girls couldn't stay at his place. I lived with my grandparents, and we ended up all crashing in my room. We were just laying in bed, talking, and I didn't think anything of it at first. But then something happened that I'm not proud of. I found myself making inappropriate advances toward Debbie, using my foot under the blanket in a way I shouldn't have. To my surprise, she didn't stop me, even though she was talking to Ashton on the phone at the time. After she hung up, things escalated further, and before I knew it, I had crossed a boundary I should never have crossed. We ended up being intimate, even though I knew it was wrong. The next morning, Debbie left with Allison, and I thought that would be the end of it. But later that day, I received a call from a friend telling me that Ashton was furious because Debbie had told him I had assaulted her. I was shocked and heartbroken because I knew what had happened was consensual, but I also realized how much I had betrayed my best friend. Ashton confronted me, and we had a few tense encounters where he punched me a couple of times. I didn't fight back because I knew I was in the wrong. Eventually, Ashton began to question Debbie's story. My friends explained to him that it didn't make sense that I could have done something like that without waking up Allison, who was right next to us. Over time, he started to see that Debbie may have twisted the truth to avoid taking responsibility for what happened between us. One night, while we were hanging out, my friend Jeremy helped us put an end to the conflict. He made us shake hands, and we eventually forgave each other. Ashton and I reconciled, and he has been my best friend ever since. It's strange how life works out. I ended up marrying Allison, Debbie's best friend, and we even stay over at Debbie's place sometimes when we visit San Francisco. A year after everything happened, Debbie called me and apologized for accusing me. She admitted that she had been scared and didn't know how to handle the situation, so she made up a story to avoid the guilt. Looking back, I realize how many poor choices I made, and I'm grateful that Ashton and I were able to move past it. It's a part of my life that I'm not proud of, but it taught me a lot about responsibility and the consequences of my actions. Story 29. Once I pulled a 120V transformer out of an old clock radio and decided to experiment with it. I connected a 9V battery to the low voltage side of the coil, which resulted in a small jolt of around 90V, but only for a brief moment when the battery was being connected. Then, I realized why transformers run on alternating current, AC. They only work when the current is changing. This created a bit of a challenge for my experiment because I needed a way to keep the current flowing while freeing up my hands to hold the wires. In a flash of creativity, I built a simple device using a cereal box, a small electric motor, a piece of aluminum foil, and some tape. The motor spun a disc covered in foil that made intermittent contact with some brushes I had fashioned out of cardboard and foil, allowing a continuous stream of tiny shocks to come from the transformer. This was how I learned about experimenting with electricity in a safe and curious way, sparking a lifelong interest in electronics. Story 30. When I was around 14, I went deer hunting early one morning, all alone in the woods. As the sun had not yet risen, I was in complete solitude, and nature has a way of making you feel at peace, but also bringing out some odd urges. I got distracted and didn't end up seeing any deer that day. Maybe they caught my scent. Another time, back in high school, a friend came over to play Grand Theft Auto 3 late into the night. As he was totally engrossed in the game, facing the TV, I found myself having trouble falling asleep. It was an odd situation, but we all had those strange teenage moments. At work, There was a period when a girl wore tight jeans every day. She eventually stopped after her boyfriend, who also worked there, asked her to. They broke up later, but I remember thinking it was probably for the best. When I was in boot camp for the Army, things were intense, and personal time was nearly non-existent. Toward the end of our training, during a field exercise, we had to dig and camouflage firing positions. After weeks of non-stop training, I took a moment to myself. Camouflage and privacy seemed to work for more than one purpose. Another time, I saw an odd video online about cutting a hole in a grapefruit, heating it up, and, well, you can guess the rest. I gave it a try, and while it was certainly an interesting experiment, it was messy and definitely not worth the effort. I'd recommend just eating the grapefruit next time. Story 31. This morning I headed to work early only to find out that I wasn't actually scheduled until the next day. So I headed back home and had some free time on my hands. I decided to hop onto my computer and visit a site where you can watch and interact with performers, with the option to tip them. One of the features of the site allows viewers to control certain aspects of the performance by tipping a certain number of tokens. I got a bit carried away, intrigued by the interactive experience. I ended up spending more tokens than I planned, which added up to about $160. It was an expensive 8 minutes, and looking back, I realized I probably could have used my time and money more wisely. Story 32. When I was in 9th grade, my family went on vacation to a pretty secluded beach. Being away from my girlfriend and having little privacy due to the living arrangements, I found the beach to be my best chance to get some time alone. I grabbed my snorkeling gear and waited until everyone was out of the water. To make sure I had some privacy, I swam out a bit into the clear, deep water. As I floated there, I made sure to keep an eye on the shoreline and underwater, just in case anyone or anything was approaching. When the moment came, I was caught off guard by what happened next. After finishing, I noticed a fish swimming straight toward me. To my surprise, it went right up to the floating debris and took a gulp before swimming off. It was one of those bizarre, unexpected moments that I still find hard to believe. Story 33. A few years ago, before my wife and I got married, we went on a date to the beach. Things were getting a bit heated between us while we were kissing when I suddenly heard someone talking. I turned around and realized there were 2 little kids just standing there watching us, and their mom was commenting on what was going on. Embarrassed, we quickly stopped and headed back to the car. Once we got to my car, we parked in a more secluded area of the beach and continued what we had started, moving into the back seat for some privacy. About 40 minutes later, we finished, got dressed, and opened the windows, only to find that a bunch of cars had parked around us. The windows were completely fogged up, and it was pretty clear what we had been up to. Over the years, we've had a few more funny moments like that, on the beach, on my mom's porch at night, and more. I always joke with my wife about how adventurous we used to be. Now we're parents of 2 boys and life has slowed down a bit, but it's fun to reminisce about those crazy times. Story 34. This story is from a while back, but I still think about it from time to time, and I definitely regret how it went down. Back in the day, whenever I was feeling particularly lonely or bored, I'd browse through Craigslist and either respond to casual encounter posts or put up my own in hopes of meeting someone. One night I wasn't having much luck in my area, so I decided to check out listings from nearby places. I came across a post from a girl in La Palma and ended up messaging her. After chatting for a while, I even got her number. The next morning, she invited me to a kink party happening later that day. Still caught up in my impulsive mindset, I agreed to drive a few hours to meet her. During the drive, I found out from the party organizer that I'd have to put down $200 for a room. Even though it felt like a bad idea, I agreed because the girl said she'd split the cost with me. Once I arrived in La Palma, I met up with a guy named BJ at a store near the hotel, handed over the $200, and went to the hotel where the party was supposed to happen. That's when things started to go downhill. I texted the organizer, but they started acting sketchy and wouldn't meet with me unless I brought the girl along. When I tried to get in touch with her, she said I had taken too long and wasn't interested anymore. At that point, I realized I'd been duped, but I kept texting the organizer, hoping it would somehow work out. After pacing around the hotel for 3 hours with no luck, I finally accepted that I had been scammed. The drive home was brutal, and I felt like an idiot, but it was a hard lesson learned. Definitely one of the more embarrassing things I've done. Story 35. I've had a close female friend for over 10 years, and our relationship was always purely platonic. I never thought of her in any romantic or physical way. A few years ago, when I was single, and she had just gotten out of a long-term relationship, We were hanging out at my place, watching movies. We'd had a few drinks, and she casually mentioned that she had been out shopping for bras earlier in the day, talking about how difficult it was to find her size. For some reason, that conversation flipped a switch in my head. All of a sudden, I couldn't stop thinking about her in a different way, which was surprising to me because I had never been attracted to her in the 6 or so years we'd been friends. I half-jokingly suggested she should show me the bras she bought, and she laughed, asking if I really wanted her to model them. A little while later, she went to the bathroom and came back wearing one of the bras. It was flattering, and I awkwardly complimented her, not really knowing how to handle the situation. She must have noticed my awkwardness because she laughed and started changing into another bra right in front of me. Things escalated quickly after that. One thing led to another, and before I knew it, we were kissing and taking off each other's clothes. We were both caught up in the moment, but after it was over, I felt a wave of guilt. As soon as the intensity of the moment had passed, I realized I didn't have any real attraction toward her, and it felt like I had crossed a line. Afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had taken advantage of the situation. Even though she was a willing participant, I still felt like I had used her in the heat of the moment. We're still close friends, and we've never crossed that line again, though she hinted at it a few times afterward. I always avoided those conversations, not wanting to repeat what happened. She occasionally jokes about our history, and while she seems comfortable with it, it still makes me cringe a little inside. From her perspective, it might have been just a fun memory, but for me it felt like I had betrayed the friendship in some way. Now we're both in relationships with other people, and I'm just glad that our friendship survived that night. Story 36. Growing up in the late 80s and 90s, a lot of things were different, especially when it came to how we accessed media. This story takes place during a time when the internet wasn't as accessible, and entertainment, especially the kind that piqued the curiosity of young boys, was hard to come by. When I was around 9 years old, I liked to draw, and at some point, I decided to try my hand at drawing an anime girl. Anime and manga were just becoming popular in my country, and I figured I'd give it a shot. I started with the face, and then moved on to the body when suddenly I realized I could add some details that made me feel a little more excited than I'd expected. The result? I ended up drawing a girl in a swimsuit with a modest design, but as a kid, it felt like something much more significant. It's funny looking back on it now, but that little drawing left an impression on me. As I grew older, other forms of media started to catch my attention. Back then, before the internet was everywhere, we had to get creative. There were the classic lingerie catalogs, or those rare moments when a friend or relative had a magazine that featured something a bit more risque. There was even a time when I used my PC magazines for, well, let's just say creative purposes, because they had tiny images from certain games that featured animated characters in suggestive poses. It seems ridiculous now, but at the time it was all part of growing up. And then there were the scrambled TV channels. Anyone who grew up in the 90s will remember those. The ones that would play adult content late at night, but the signal was scrambled so you couldn't see it properly. I got clever one day and found a way to use a computer program to try to unscramble the signal. It wasn't perfect, but it worked well enough for me to see something recognizable, and at that age, it felt like a major achievement. Of course, this wasn't always the case. Back in the early days of computers, I remember getting overly excited about a game ad in a pamphlet that came with one of my PC games. The game was called Leather Goddesses of Phobos 2, and even though the images were tiny, no bigger than half an inch, I was fascinated. It was nothing more than a few drawings and a brief description, but I spent hours thinking about what the game might be like, even though I hadn't actually played it. In hindsight, it was a comical mix of curiosity, imagination, and youth. It's funny to look back at how creative and resourceful we had to be when it came to accessing media back then. Growing up in that era was definitely a different experience, but it also gave me some memorable stories to tell. Story 37. When I was about 12 or 13, I was at my grandparents' house with the whole family. Parents, aunts, uncles, everyone. I was laying on the floor in the living room, casually reading a book. This was something I did all the time, so it wasn't out of the ordinary. However, I suddenly found myself dealing with the awkward reality of being a teenager and getting random surges of energy. In the moment, I started to subtly shift around on the floor. At the time, I didn't think anyone noticed, and I kept it minimal. But looking back, I realize it probably wasn't as subtle as I thought. The embarrassment still lingers when I think about it. No way everyone missed that. Then, when I was 14, during my freshman year in high school, I had another awkward moment. I was in a CAD class one day, and the lights were off while the teacher gave a presentation on the projector. My mind began to wander, and I started daydreaming about a girl from one of my other classes. Absent-mindedly, I ended up fidgeting with my hand in my pocket, and before I knew it, things went a bit further than intended. Suddenly realizing what had happened, I had to awkwardly ask to be excused so I could go to the bathroom and clean up. The rest of the day was incredibly uncomfortable, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the teacher had figured out what was going on. Definitely not one of my finest moments as a teenager. Story 38. One night after hanging out with friends, I found myself waiting for an Uber to take me home. It was around 5 a.m., and I had just finished eating and chatting after the bars closed. While I was waiting, a guy came by and struck up a conversation with me. He wasn't homeless. He had a nice coat on and mentioned he worked in construction, but he was asking for tips to make some extra cash. I gave him a couple of dollars, and we started chatting about the night. As we talked, I mentioned that I was gay, and he responded by saying he was bi. Things took an unexpected turn when he asked if I wanted to see him. Feeling adventurous, I canceled my Uber, and we walked around for a while until we found a spot in a nearby alley. It was a bit sketchy, but at the time I wasn't thinking too much about it. We ended up messing around for a bit, though nothing major happened, just some casual fooling around. After a while, he suddenly said he was done and asked me for $20. This caught me completely off guard because there had been no discussion about money. When I told him that I hadn't agreed to that, he became really aggressive and threatened to cause a scene if I didn't pay him. At that point, I was scared. He mentioned that he had been to jail before and was willing to go back if it came to that. The whole situation made me really uncomfortable, and I was worried about what could happen if things escalated. In the end, I decided to just give him the $20 so I could get out of there safely. It was a tough lesson to learn, and looking back, I realized how much I had put myself in a risky situation. I was relieved to get out of it without anything worse happening, but I definitely won't be making that kind of decision again. It's one of those experiences that sticks with you, and you learn to trust your instincts in the future. Story 39. About a year ago, I shared this story in response to a similar question, and here it is again, in all its awkward glory. I met a guy on a dating app called Badoo, which is similar to Tinder. What first attracted me to him was that he was visiting from Peru, and I thought that was exotic at the time. We chatted, and I found his accent really charming, which sealed the deal for me to meet him in person. When he arrived at my place, it was clear he was nervous. He was shaking when he hugged me. Still, he was handsome, and his accent was as charming in person as it was on the phone. We sat down, and after a few minutes, he texted me saying he wanted to kiss me, which made me smile because it was a bit shy and sweet. So I leaned over and kissed him. But then I noticed something, a very strong, overwhelming smell. It hit me out of nowhere. He was sweating quite a bit, and the smell quickly filled the room. I was caught off guard, but I tried to focus on the positives, his accent, his appearance, and the fact that it had been a while since I had been with anyone. As we took our clothes off, the smell only got worse, filling every inch of the room. At this point, I was questioning my life choices, but figured I might as well see it through. When he finally took off his underwear, I realized things weren't going to get much better. He wasn't exactly what I was hoping for, and I was starting to seriously regret everything. Still, he put on a condom, and we had what felt like the longest 5 minutes of my life. He was clearly thrilled, but I was ready for it to be over. I ended up faking my enthusiasm just to wrap things up faster. Afterward, as we got dressed, he told me it was the best experience he'd ever had and that he wanted to see me again. I forced a smile and said, "Yeah, maybe we'll do it again sometime." But in my mind, I was already planning an escape. Once he left, I realized that the smell had spread throughout half of my house. I immediately grabbed some cleaning spray and started dousing every room he had been in. It took a while, but eventually, the smell faded, and I could finally breathe again. Needless to say, that was an experience I never wanted to repeat. Story 40. When I was about 13, my family and I took an overseas trip, and like most family vacations, we were always together. Privacy was pretty hard to come by, especially when it came to sharing rooms. During one particular night, we were all staying in a hotel room with 2 queen-sized beds. With my parents focused on the TV and my brother in the shower, I thought I'd have a bit of time to myself to relax. I decided to take a long shower, but when someone knocked on the door, asking what was taking so long, I had to cut it short. Still determined to enjoy some quiet time, I slipped under the covers, hoping to be discreet. I figured as long as I was subtle, I could keep things low-key until my brother got back from the bathroom. Unfortunately, he came back out before I was finished, but I stayed determined to remain unnoticed. My parents were still focused on the TV, and my brother didn't seem to pay much attention to what I was doing under the sheets. Somehow, I managed to stay under the radar. But let's just say the hotel sheets probably had to deal with more than I'd planned for. I hope the cleaning staff didn't have too much to handle the next morning. Looking back, it was one of those cringe-worthy teenage moments where privacy was a rare luxury. I'm just glad it went unnoticed, and it's a funny memory to laugh about now. Story 41. When I was 25, I had a stopover in Las Vegas, on my way to San Diego from Wisconsin. It was my first time in Vegas, and after having a few drinks, I found myself feeling adventurous. I started out playing the quarter slots, but after a while, I decided to check out one of the famous Vegas strip clubs. I spent most of the evening there, hanging out and chatting with one of the dancers. As the night wound down, around 2:30 a.m., I was still feeling a bit impulsive and asked the doorman for directions to a well-known spot outside of town, a place I'd heard of called the Chicken Ranch. Without really thinking things through, and definitely a bit too tipsy, I got in my car and drove about 45 minutes to this remote location. When I arrived, I was greeted and introduced to a group of women. I ended up picking a kind and friendly Latina, and we headed back to her room. She went over the rules and gave me a list of options, but by that point, my energy and budget was low, so I opted for the most basic option. The next morning, I woke up in the back of my Subaru in the parking lot of the ranch. Feeling a bit embarrassed about my late-night decisions, I drove to a nearby RV park, snuck into the showers, and cleaned myself up, trying to wash away the remnants of the previous night's impulsiveness. It's one of those stories I've never told anyone about, but looking back, it was a reminder of how easy it is to make decisions in the heat of the moment that don't exactly align with your better judgment. Story 42. I had a friend in university who had a serious crush on a particular girl and was determined to win her over, even if his methods were a bit over the top. They had known each other for a while, and he'd often go out of his way to chat with her. One day, he conveniently decided to accompany her on the bus, pretending that he lived in the same direction, all in an attempt to spend more time with her. You know, the usual approach to try and build some connection. But when things didn't progress the way he wanted, he decided to up the ante in a rather unusual way. He pulled out his acting skills, crafting a storyline to show off his sensitive side. This plan involved him getting emotional, even shedding a few tears in an effort to make the situation more dramatic, all while they were still on public transportation. It was a bold and, in my opinion, a bit of a desperate move to try to impress her. I can't remember if his plan worked out in the end. This happened so many years ago. But I do remember thinking at the time that it was one of the most over-the-top things I'd ever heard just to try to get someone's attention. It was a bit cringeworthy, and I couldn't help but question my friend about why he thought such an extreme approach would work. However, knowing the environment we were in, being student musicians in Latin America, it wasn't entirely shocking. There was always this sense of the chase among some of the guys, and they'd go to great lengths to try to impress someone. This particular incident, though, really stood out as one of the most outrageous attempts I'd ever witnessed. Story 43. I had an embarrassing moment back in 7th grade during third period social studies. At that age, I just started figuring out how things worked with my body and thought the only way to get rid of a sudden urge or a bit of discomfort was to, well, take matters into my own hands. One day I spotted a girl I had a crush on in class, and sure enough, I found myself in an awkward situation. In a bit of a panic, I grabbed my jacket, placed it over my lap, and tried to discreetly deal with things under the desk. It wasn't long before one of my classmates noticed something odd and asked half-jokingly if I was doing something suspicious. A few of his friends joined in, laughing and making jokes. At that moment, I froze, completely mortified. I thought for sure I had been caught, and the whole class would find out. But, to my relief, my best friend, who was sitting next to me, jumped in and defended me. He told everyone that I was just tapping my foot under the desk and to leave me alone. Thankfully, that seemed to work, and the other kids let it go. Looking back, I have no idea how the teacher didn't catch on because, in hindsight, it must have been pretty obvious what was going on. It's definitely one of those memories that still makes me cringe, but at least I was saved by a good friend that day.